you're planning to immigrate to Canada in 2026, you know how important it is to obtain your CLB7 with the TCF or the TEF so you can obtain permanent residence. I've seen many students lose months of progress because they picked the wrong exam. Today I'm going to break down the difference between the TEF and the TCF and why I call the TEF a student's worst nightmare, whereas the TCF is almost always the better choice. There are 4 sections in both exams: the reading, the writing, the speaking, and the listening. In the TCF, there are more tasks. However, more tasks does not mean that they're harder. On the contrary, they're actually easier. You have 3 tasks in the TCF. First, an email with 80 words, where you're writing to a friend and inviting them to something. Then you have the second task, which is a blog, where you describe an event. Write a blog about your experience in Tibet. When it comes to writing an essay, the structure will be exactly the same. You will follow the same structure: an introduction, a thesis, an antithesis, a synthesis, and a conclusion. In the first task of the TEF, you need to continue a story in the past. Many people block at that point. They don't know what to talk about. They have no imagination because they're too nervous to come up with the idea. You need to continue the story in 120 words, as if you were a newspaper reporter. For example, 2 days ago in New York City, a lion escaped from the zoo. They used 3 different versions of the past: the passé composé, the imparfait, and the plus que parfait. Most people get completely confused with that. In the speaking section of the TCF, you have 3 tasks. In the TEF, you have 2 tasks. The mistake is to think that the TEF is easier because there are only 2 tasks. TCF, task number 1, you need to introduce yourself and talk about your personal life and establish a dialogue with the examiner. Task number 2, you need to obtain information on a formal or an informal subject. We don't know which one it will be. In task number 3, you will be asked to give a presentation on a given topic that will be said out loud, will not be written on a piece of paper. It's very easy to make a presentation of 4.5 minutes once you know how to write a structured essay. You're basically saying your essay out loud. For the TEF, there are only 2 tasks. However, they're more difficult. The first task is to obtain information, exactly like the TCF, on a formal or an informal topic. We don't know. TEF is much more difficult because you have to convince the examiner to do something they do not want to do within a period of 10 minutes. And you have to improvise because the examiner is going to respond in ways that you do not expect. They are going to come up with excuses why they don't want to do what you're asking them to do, which you have no way of knowing ahead of time. So you have to improvise on the spur of the moment. That's very difficult to do in your second language, especially when you're under pressure. And this is where it feels like your worst nightmare. It feels like it's never going to end. You keep coming up against the examiner's resistance, the examiner's refusal, the examiner's rejection, and it feels disconcerting. It's like you'll never see the light at the end of the tunnel until you reach that 9.5 minutes of your speech. So unless you're a natural negotiator and an expert in sales, I highly recommend a TCF because all you need to do is give a 4.5 minute presentation, which you can practice if you know how to write a proper essay. When it comes to passive skills like listening, for example, TEF and TCF are slightly different. In the TCF, you'll have 39 questions in 35 minutes. For the TEF, you have a marathon of 40 questions in 40 minutes. The only difference, which actually is important, is that you don't get to read the questions before the answer in the TCF. However, in the TEF, you will see the question written on the screen, so you can analyze it before you answer. That is a major difference, because it gives you time to process the information before you give your answer. The listening section of both exams is very different from the oral section. In the listening section, you have a series of multiple choice questions that take you from A1 all the way to C2. The more questions you can answer in C2, the higher score you'll get. The A1 questions are very easy to answer. They're usually a question of identifying a word in relation to a picture, and then identifying an expression that somebody should say in response to someone else, or somebody giving an opinion. Is it a positive or a negative opinion? Finally, they will give you a longer script that you have to listen to on a newscast, for example, or an interview, and then you have to answer the question. So the TEF may be a lot longer. However, it's a lot easier because you actually read the question before you give your answer. If the listening section is what you find the most challenging, then the TEF would be the way to go for you. The reading section of the TCF and the TEF is different from the writing section and the speaking section. You have a series of questions to answer. You have 35 questions in 60 minutes for the TCF, which are progressively difficult from A1 till C2. The reading becomes more and more complex towards C2. In the TEF, on the other hand, you have 50 questions you need to answer in 60 minutes. In TEF, you need to answer questions about everyday topics. So there are concrete situations that just require an answer. It's different from the TCF, and it's not progressively more difficult. The type of content you'll get, for example, in the reading section, is you have to identify words within an advertisement, or you might have an invitation email where you have to identify who is writing to who, or you will have an article that you have to analyze and answer a question to. So ultimately, the TCF may be a little more difficult because it takes you into a C2 level, but you'll get more points if you're a good reader. So I recommend you take the TCF exam because learning structure is easier than winning an argument in a second language. The TEF tests your ability to argue in your second language, whereas the TCF basically tests your understanding of the language and how you master the structure and the syntax of the grammar. Here's an extra tip for your exam. You should be practicing every single day. You're listening and you're reading in mock tests and aiming for a C1, C2 level. Because if you can get the C1, C2 level during the exam, even if you miss a few questions, you will certainly get a B2. So if you're planning on passing the TCF or the TEF in the next few months, and you need a structured plan that will get you there with 30 years of experience, contact us at Bravo Langue and we'll make sure you do. Check out the link in our description and subscribe for more tips.